Today, we heard the good news that a great French icon, the singer Johnny Hallyday, is recovering in hospital after an illness. Since the 1960s, Le Johnny's been a constantly popular symbol of true French values. But what of another French figure who also strode the globe in the 1960s? He even made it into Monty Python.
It's a funny thing, freedom. I mean, how can any of us be really free when we still have personal possessions? You can't. Well, this, of course, is the old crux of Jean-Paul Sartre's Roads to Freedom.
No, it bloody isn't. The nub of that is, his characters stand for all of us in their desire to avoid action.
I personally think that Jean-Paul's masterwork is an allegory of man's search for commitment.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
It isn't. No, it isn't.
All right, as soon as settle this, we'll ask him.
Good morning, Mrs. Cutout.
An in-depth discussion there of the last of this week's sacred monsters, great cultural figures who have fallen from grace. Jean-Paul Sartre, surely the leading contender for the title of ultimate French philosopher, black polo neck and all. Sartre's career was a phenomenal success, literally so, as he became most associated with the idea of existentialism, which derived from the concept of phenomenology. In Sartre's own words, the idea that we are condemned to be free. But since his death nearly 30 years ago, revelations about his fellow have sunk quicker than you can say phenomenology after a couple of Courvoisiers. So is there really no exit from the remainder pile of philosophical history for Sartre? We've summoned up two philosophers who will sort out être from néant for us. Here in the studio, Jonathan Ray, and down the line from Rabat in Morocco, Andrew Hussey. Jonathan, Jean-Paul Sartre, he was a man who in the 1968 uprisings, he spoke to students and strikers alike. When he died, 20,000 people turned out on the streets of Paris for his funeral. I mean, he was a global phenomenon, wasn't he?
He was globally notorious. I mean, I think, you say that he's fallen from grace. I don't think he ever was really quite in a state of grace. He was always enormously controversial. I mean, I think outside France, he stood for the idea of the slightly unreliable, slightly too full of themselves French. And within France, I mean, what did he stand for? He stood for condemning the Catholic Church. He hated the bureaucratization of intellectual life in France. He hated the state-centered politics. He hated the patriarchal family. He was public enemy number one as far as the French establishment is concerned. If he was
public enemy number one, then why did they love him? I mean, Charles de Gaulle refused to have him arrested when he was, essentially taking part in a protest in 1968 on the grounds that you don't arrest Voltaire. I mean, that's quite a comparison for your enemy to make of you.
Well, I guess so. I mean, if he was public enemy, he was at least public enemy number one. And also because by that time, his great work was really in the 40s. He was already an old man by 1968. So you could say that from de Gaulle's point of view, he was no longer very dangerous. And the other thing that had happened was that during the 50s, he had represented I think particularly to teenage boys in France and in the French colonies, he'd represented something incredibly glamorous. It was because it was a revolt against all the establishment order. And these boys grew up to be the great Foucault, the great Derrida, the great Bourdieu, and all of them began their intellectual careers by rubbishing Sartre. I mean, I think later on they felt a bit bad about it, and they repaired the damage. But there was a kind of Oedipal murder that took place in the 60s.
Okay, so Andrew, essentially a sort of role model poster boy figure for the next generation of young French philosophers. In other words, a glamorous figure who mattered, whatever you thought of him. But this image didn't last, did it? It faded away. Why did that image of Sartre change for the wider public, do you think?
I don't buy the notion really that Sartre was public enemy number one, this deeply controversial figure. I think he was a very sort of reactionary left-wing figure in lots of ways, a kind of a monument of French ideas and French culture, which inevitably is fading away, and which I think is a very healthy thing. I think it's worth pointing out that the invention of the intellectual is essentially a 19th century phenomenon, and through the 20th century, I think Sartre was a great writer. He was a good writer, not a great writer, and he was a good polemicist, but as a philosopher, I don't think anybody who really understands philosophy takes him seriously. But more importantly, as a political philosopher, as a Marxist, he was a joke. And I think it's actually a very healthy phenomenon that the dead language of classical French Marxism has faded away to that extent. And when you make the point about 1968, he never connected with the workers, he'd never connected with the strikers properly. And that is, in some ways, the kind of paralysed revolt that characterises a lot of the quixotic stuff that goes on in the French left. So essentially, I would say he was a posh kid kicking against the pricks. That's what he was doing. He was revolting against the bourgeoisie, and the best work he did produce in the 1930s and the 1940s is essentially built out of that teenage angst.